The smoke rose straight and steady from the wooden chimney top, 12 feet above the snow-buried cabin roof. Inside, William Calhoun watched the flames in his stone fireplace dance with perfect draw, no backdraft, no choking smoke. While outside, the third blizzard in 8 days howled across the Montana Territory. 2 miles down the valley, he knew Martin Driscoll's all-stone chimney had cracked 3 days ago, filling his cabin with smoke and forcing him to abandon it in 20 below temperatures. The hybrid chimney that everyone had called suicide by fire when William built it last autumn was the only reason he was still alive. Before we go further, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and if you're fascinated by frontier survival innovation, hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's story involves a trapper who survived 2 weeks trapped in his cabin, and the ending will leave you stunned. The year was 1842. November had arrived in the Montana Territory with unusual ferocity, and William Calhoun was beginning his 7th winter in the mountains. He had survived 6 previous winters trapping beaver along the tributaries of the Yellowstone River, and he understood the rhythms of mountain weather better than most men. But the patterns developing that autumn were different from anything he had experienced before. Standard frontier chimney construction had remained essentially unchanged for decades. Trappers and mountain men built chimneys from stacked river stones, mortared with clay and sand, rising 4 to 5 feet above the roofline. The design was simple, quick to construct, and adequate for normal winters. Most men could build a functional stone chimney in 3 to 4 days of hard work. The chimney would draw smoke, provide reasonable draft for the fire, and require minimal maintenance. William's own cabin featured exactly this type of construction. His chimney stood 5 feet above the roof, built from flat river stones he had gathered over the course of a week 2 autumns earlier. The structure had served him well through 2 winters without significant problems. He had chinked the gaps between stones with clay mixed with grass, and the mortar had held reasonably well despite the freeze-thaw cycles of mountain weather. But in early November of 1842, reports began filtering through the scattered trapping community that worried William deeply. A trapper named Richard Hayes, working territory 30 miles north, had arrived at the trading post with news that his chimney had cracked during an early cold snap. The crack ran vertically through 3 courses of stone, allowing smoke to pour into his cabin. Hayes had been forced to extinguish his fire and spend 2 nights in near-freezing temperatures while he attempted repairs with frozen clay that wouldn't properly set. Another man, Benjamin Ward, reported that heavy snow from an October storm had accumulated on his short chimney, blocking the flue opening and backing smoke into his cabin until he could climb onto his roof and clear it. The snow had been wet and heavy, and Ward mentioned that clearing the chimney had been dangerous work on an icy, sloped roof. William began paying attention to his own chimney with new scrutiny. He noticed things he had previously ignored. The mortar between some stones had small cracks from the previous winter's freeze-thaw cycles. The chimney had settled slightly, creating a barely perceptible lean. The 5-foot height, which had seemed adequate, now appeared marginal. If snow accumulated to 3 or 4 feet, his chimney would barely clear the surface. The weather forecasts, such as they existed on the frontier, were troubling. Trappers who had lived in the mountains for decades were predicting an unusually harsh winter based on signs William had learned to respect. The beavers were building larger lodges than normal. The pine trees had produced an exceptional crop of cones. The bears had been feeding with unusual intensity before hibernation. Every indicator suggested a winter of extreme cold and heavy snowfall. William spent a week running his trap lines while thinking obsessively about chimneys. He visited the cabins of other trappers when routes took him near their camps, examining their chimney construction with an intensity that must have seemed strange. He saw the same basic design everywhere, the same 4 to 5 foot stone structures, the same potential weaknesses. The pattern became clear. Every chimney design he examined had fatal flaws that would emerge under sustained extreme weather. Short chimneys would be buried by heavy snow. Tall stone chimneys, which some men had attempted to build, invariably developed cracks from the weight and thermal stress. The physics seemed inescapable. Stone was strong but heavy and brittle under extreme temperature differentials. On November 12th, During a cold night in his cabin, William made a decision that would seem insane to any other mountain man. He would tear down his functional chimney and rebuild it using an untested design in November, with winter already closing in. William Calhoun was the son of a stonemason from Pennsylvania. His father, Robert Calhoun, had built chimneys and foundations throughout Lancaster County for 30 years before his death in 1831. William had worked alongside his father from age 12 until age 22, learning masonry techniques that most frontier trappers never encountered. He understood how stone behaved under stress, how mortar cured and failed, and how structures distributed weight. William had also learned carpentry. His maternal uncle ran a sawmill and timber operation, and William had spent summers working there, learning how wood could be shaped and joined. This dual knowledge of stone and wood made him unusual among mountain men, most of whom had rudimentary building skills at best. During the week, following his decision to rebuild, William analyzed the chimney problem with systematic precision. He identified 4 distinct failure modes that killed standard chimney designs under extreme conditions. The first failure mode was burial by snow. Chimneys built 4 to 5 feet above the roofline would be completely covered by snow accumulation of 4 feet or more. Once buried, the chimney opening became blocked. Smoke could not escape. The fire would either fill the cabin with smoke or extinguish itself. Either outcome meant no heat, and no heat meant death within days. The second failure mode was structural collapse. Some trappers had attempted to build stone chimneys 8 to 10 feet tall. These structures invariably failed. The weight of stacked stone became too great. Snow load added stress. Wind created lateral forces. Tall stone chimneys cracked at their bases or toppled during storms. The third failure mode was thermal stress cracking. Stone expanded when heated and contracted when cooled. A chimney experiencing 800-degree temperatures inside and 40 below zero outside underwent extreme stress. The temperature differential caused expansion and contraction at different rates. Stone cracked under this stress, allowing smoke to leak into the cabin. The fourth failure mode was foundation shifting. Mountain cabins were built without proper foundations. Freeze-thaw cycles caused ground movement. Heavy chimneys shifted as ground beneath them settled. This created cracks at the base where chimney met cabin. William had observed all 4 failure modes over his years in the mountains. The problem seemed unsolvable. Heavy stone structures could not be built tall enough without collapsing. Light wooden structures would burn. Every material had disqualifying limitations. For 3 days, William sketched designs on bark using charcoal from his fire. He drew tall stone chimneys with reinforced bases. He drew wooden frames supporting stone. Every design had a fatal flaw. The breakthrough came on November 16th. William was outside, observing smoke rising from his chimney. The smoke was hot and visible at the chimney top, 5 feet above the roofline. But as smoke rose higher into cold air, it cooled and dissipated. By 10 or 12 feet above the roofline, the smoke was no longer hot enough to burn. At what exact height does smoke cool enough that wood placed there would not ignite? That was the question nobody had asked. William began work on November 18, 1842. The temperature hovered near 20 degrees, cold enough to make outdoor work uncomfortable, but not yet dangerous. He started by carefully dismantling his existing chimney, salvaging every usable stone. Each stone was examined, tested by tapping with a hammer to detect hidden cracks, and sorted by size and shape. Stones with any structural weakness were discarded. The foundation required special attention. William's existing chimney had no proper foundation, simply resting on the cabin roof logs like most frontier chimneys. The new chimney would be taller and would include external bracing that would transfer lateral loads downward. William reinforced the roof structure beneath where his chimney would sit. He added 2 additional roof beams, thick pine logs that he notched into the existing cabin wall logs. These beams distributed the chimney weight across a larger area. The stone base construction began on November 20th. William had decided on specific dimensions through careful calculation. The interior flue opening would be 12 inches square, large enough for adequate draft, but small enough to maintain heat velocity. The exterior dimensions would be 24 inches square at the base, tapering to 18 inches square at the top. This taper reduced weight at the top and created a natural shedding angle for snow. William mixed his mortar with obsessive care. Clay from a deposit near the creek was combined, with coarse sand in a 3-to-1 ratio. He added water gradually, mixing with his hands until the consistency allowed the mortar to hold shape but remain workable. He measured proportions using a wooden cup he had carved specifically for this purpose. The first course of stones went down slowly. Each stone was set in a thick bed of mortar, leveled carefully, and checked for alignment. William used a plumb line made from a stone tied to string to ensure the walls rose vertically. Any deviation from vertical would create weak points where cracks would eventually form. He worked alone, lifting stones that sometimes weighed 40 pounds, positioning them precisely, scraping away excess mortar. His hands became raw from the cold and the rough stone surfaces. The work proceeded at roughly 1 vertical foot per day. By November 24th, the stone base stood 4 feet above the roofline. The interior of the stone section included a critical feature that William had learned from his father. At a height of 2 feet above the fireplace opening, he built a smoke shelf. This was a horizontal stone ledge that protruded into the flue space, creating an offset. The smoke shelf deflected downdrafts that would otherwise blow smoke back into the cabin, and it radiated heat back downward, improving fireplace efficiency. On November 25th, William lit a small test fire. He watched smoke rise through the stone chimney and exit cleanly at the top. More importantly, he monitored the temperature. After 2 hours of burning, he climbed onto his roof and held his hand at the top of the stone section. The heat was intense but tolerable. This was the critical measurement. At this height, approximately 8 feet above his fireplace, the smoke and heat had cooled enough. Wood could survive here. The stone base was complete. The junction between stone and wood represented the most dangerous aspect of William's design. If he miscalculated the heat transfer at this point, the +80 NDR, the wooden section would ignite and his cabin would burn. Mountain men had lost cabins to chimney fires before. The risk was real and potentially fatal. William's solution involved creating an insulation barrier using clay, but this was not the simple clay and sand mortar he had used between stones. This barrier needed to withstand sustained high temperatures while insulating effectively enough to prevent wood from reaching ignition temperature. He spent 2 days preparing the clay mixture. The base was local clay, the same material he had used for mortar, but he modified it with specific additives. He mixed in wood ash from his fireplace at a ratio of 1 part ash to 4 parts clay. The ash reduced cracking during the drying and curing process. He added horsehair pulled from his pack animal's tail and mane, chopping it into pieces approximately 2 inches long. The hair acted as reinforcement, similar to how steel rods reinforce concrete. Finally, he added sand for structural strength. The mixing process took hours. William worked the materials together with his hands, adding water gradually until he achieved a consistency that was pliable but not sticky. The mixture needed to hold its shape when formed, but remain workable enough to pack tightly without air gaps. On November 27th, William began building the transition platform. At the top of his stone chimney, he built up layers of his special clay mixture. The clay extended inward from the stone walls, narrowing the flue opening from 12 inches square to 8 inches square. This narrowing served a purpose beyond just creating a platform. The reduced opening increased the velocity of rising smoke and heat, which improved draft and further cooled the gases through expansion. The clay platform built up 3 inches thick. William worked carefully, packing the material tightly, smoothing the surfaces, ensuring no gaps or weak spots. The interior surface of the narrowed flue he smoothed until it was nearly polished. Rough surfaces would create turbulence and reduce draft efficiency. While the clay platform cured, William worked on another critical component. During a trip to check his trap lines, he had detoured to an abandoned trapper camp 8 miles from his cabin. The camp had been deserted for at least 2 years. The cabin partially collapsed, but inside the ruins, William had found a section of iron stovepipe, approximately 12 inches long and 6 inches in diameter. The pipe was rusted but structurally sound. He had carried it back to his cabin. This stovepipe would form the liner for his wooden chimney section. The iron pipe would contain the hottest smoke and gases, creating an air gap between the heat source and the wooden walls. The air gap was the key. Air is an excellent insulator. The gap would allow heat to dissipate before reaching the wood. William embedded the base of the stovepipe into his clay platform while the clay was still workable. He pressed it down until half the pipe's diameter was buried in clay. He packed additional clay around the outside, creating a seal. The embedded section would be locked in place once the clay cured. For 3 days, William maintained small fires while the clay platform cured and hardened. William began constructing the wooden chimney section on December 2nd. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees and a light snow was falling. He worked quickly, aware that serious winter weather could arrive at any time and make outdoor construction impossible. The wood selection was critical. William needed straight-grained pine logs that would split cleanly and remain stable. He had spent the previous week cutting and preparing logs from trees he had selected specifically for this purpose. Each log was approximately 8 inches in diameter and 8 feet long. He split them into quarters using wedges and a maul, creating pieces that were roughly 4 inches thick at their widest point. From these split sections, William cut individual building pieces 18 inches long. Each piece required careful work with his axe and draw knife to create flat surfaces on 2 sides while leaving the rounded exterior intact. The flat interior surfaces would face the flue opening. The rounded exterior surfaces would form the outside of the chimney. He needed 32 pieces to build the 8-foot wooden extension. The construction method was log cabin style, also called crib construction. William laid 4 pieces in a square, each piece perpendicular to its neighbors. The interior opening formed by these 4 pieces was 8 inches square, matching the diameter of his iron stovepipe with room for an air gap. The exterior dimensions were 18 inches square. At each corner, William cut simple notches that allowed the pieces to interlock. These notches were not decorative. They prevented the pieces from shifting laterally and transferred weight from upper layers down through the structure. Each notch was cut by hand, tested for fit, and adjusted until the joint was tight. William placed the first layer directly onto his cured clay platform, arranging the 4 pieces around the protruding iron stovepipe. The stovepipe rose through the center of the square opening, creating a 2-inch air gap on all sides between the hot iron and the wooden walls. He applied a thin layer of his clay mixture to the top of the first wooden layer, but only on the exterior-facing surfaces. The interior surfaces facing the air gap remained uncoated. This was intentional. The air gap needed to remain open to function as insulation. Sealing it would defeat the purpose. The second layer went down perpendicular to the first, each piece resting on 2 pieces below, creating the interlocking pattern. William continued this pattern, layer by layer, checking periodically to ensure the structure remained square and vertical. Every 4th layer, he paused to verify that the stovepipe remained centered, with equal air gaps on all sides. The work proceeded slowly. Each piece required lifting, positioning, checking, and securing. William's hands were cold despite leather gloves. The wooden pieces were heavy, awkward to maneuver while balancing on the roof. By December 5th, the wooden extension stood complete. 8 feet of wooden crib structure rose above the stone base. The total height was now 12 feet above the roof line. The stovepipe extended through the entire wooden section, terminating at the top. From the ground, the chimney looked absurdly tall and impossibly fragile. The wooden section swayed visibly in the wind. The wooden chimney extension swayed in even moderate wind. William could see the movement from inside his cabin, watching the top describe small circles against the sky. The structure was tall, narrow, and lightweight. Without external support, it would collapse during the first serious storm. The bracing system was not optional, it was essential. William had planned the bracing configuration before beginning construction. He needed a system that would prevent lateral movement in any direction while distributing force efficiently to avoid overstressing any single connection point. The solution was triangular geometry. A triangle is the strongest structural shape because forces applied to any point are distributed to the other 2 points. The structure cannot deform without breaking one of its sides. He selected 4 straight pine poles for the braces. Each pole was 8 feet long and approximately 4 inches in diameter. He had cut these poles weeks earlier, choosing trees that grew straight and without significant taper. He stripped the bark completely and allowed them to dry slightly, which reduced weight without significantly compromising strength. The bracing pattern would form an X shape when viewed from 2 sides of the chimney. 2 poles would run from the roof to the chimney on the north-south axis. 2 more would run from roof to chimney on the east-west axis. Where the poles crossed, they would support each other, creating additional rigidity. The lower attachment points required reinforcement. William could not simply rest the poles on the roof surface. The force transferred through the braces during high winds would tear through roof planking. He needed to anchor the braces to the structural roof beams beneath the surface. He cut away sections of his sod roof at 4 points, exposing the heavy pine logs that formed the roof structure. He notched these beams to create seats for the brace poles. The upper attachment points were equally critical. The braces needed to connect to the wooden chimney section at a height that provided optimal leverage without creating excessive stress concentration. William calculated that attaching the braces 6 feet up the 8-foot wooden section would create a 45-degree angle from roof to chimney. This angle was ideal for distributing both vertical and lateral forces. He used leather straps to bind the braces to the chimney. These were not decorative leather strips. They were thick, wet rawhide cut from elk he had taken the previous autumn. William soaked the rawhide in water until it was pliable, then wrapped it tightly around both the brace pole and the wooden chimney, creating multiple turns that overlapped. As the rawhide dried, it would shrink, creating a connection of tremendous strength, but leather alone was not sufficient. William drilled holes through both the brace poles and the wooden chimney at each connection point using a hand auger. Through these holes, he drove wooden pegs he had carved from seasoned oak. The pegs were tapered slightly, driven in with a mallet until they would go no farther. The combination of shrinking rawhide and oak pegs created connections that were effectively permanent. He completed the bracing installation on December 8th. The chimney no longer swayed. December 9th, 1842. William stood inside his cabin, looking at the completed chimney system. 3 weeks of work had produced something that looked improbable and potentially dangerous. A stone base topped with 8 feet of wooden structure, braced with poles that made the entire assembly look like some kind of primitive siege engine rather than a functional chimney. He had prepared for the possibility of catastrophic failure. 2 wooden buckets sat filled with water near the door. His axe leaned against the wall, positioned where he could grab it quickly to chop away the bracing if fire spread to the wooden chimney section. He had cleared a path to the door, ensuring nothing would impede a rapid exit if the cabin filled with smoke or flames. William had built fires in the fireplace during construction, small fires used to test the stone section and cure the clay transition platform. But those had been modest blazes, carefully controlled, producing minimal heat. A real test required a real fire, the kind of fire necessary to heat a cabin during a Montana winter. That meant sustained high temperatures, continuous burning, and maximum stress on every component of his hybrid design. He started with kindling, small pieces of dry pine that caught easily from his flint and steel. The kindling burned hot and fast, flames licking upward into the stone chimney base. Smoke rose smoothly through the flue and exited at the top of the wooden section 12 feet above. No backdraft, no leaks visible anywhere in the system. So far, so good. William added larger pieces of wood, building the fire gradually. He wanted to monitor the temperature increase at different points in the chimney, watching for problems before they became disasters. Every few minutes, he went outside to inspect the wooden section, touching the exterior surface at various heights, checking for heat transfer that would indicate his air gap insulation was failing. After 30 minutes of burning, the stone section was hot to the touch, but not dangerously so. The clay transition platform was warm but stable, showing no cracks or signs of deterioration. The wooden section remained cool except for a small area immediately surrounding where the iron stovepipe passed through. That area was warm but not hot enough to char the wood. William increased the fire size again, adding larger logs, building toward the sustained burn rate he would need during cold weather. The flames grew intense. heat radiating from the fireplace into the cabin. Outside, smoke poured from the top of the chimney in a thick column that rose straight up in the still air. 1 hour into the test, William checked the wooden chimney section again. He could hold his palm flat against the exterior wood for a full 10 count without discomfort. The air gap was working. Heat from the iron stovepipe was dissipating into the gap rather than transferring through to the outer wooden walls. By evening, the fire had burned continuously for 6 hours. The cabin was warm. The chimney showed no signs of stress, charring, or structural problems. William maintained the fire through the night, checking every hour, watching for any indication of failure. None came. January 4, 1843. William woke to a pressure change he could feel in his bones. The barometric pressure was dropping rapidly, a sure sign of approaching weather. By mid-morning, the sky had turned the peculiar gray-white color that preceded heavy snow. Temperature was falling, already down to 10 degrees and still dropping. Wind was picking up from the northwest. The blizzard arrived at noon. Within an hour, visibility dropped to less than 50 feet. Snow fell heavily, driven horizontal by wind gusting to 40 miles per hour. William built up his fire, knowing the test was beginning. This was what his hybrid chimney was designed to survive. A standard short chimney would be buried within hours. He monitored the system carefully through the afternoon. Snow accumulated on the roof at a rate of approximately 1 inch per hour. By evening, 3 feet of snow covered the cabin roof. A standard 5-foot chimney would now have only 2 feet of clearance above the snow surface. By midnight, with 5 feet of snow on the roof, a standard chimney would be completely buried or dangerously close to blockage. William's 12-foot chimney still stood 8 feet above the snow surface, drawing perfectly. The bracing system held steady under the snow load. The wooden section showed no signs of ice accumulation. Heat radiating from the stovepipe inside kept the wooden chimney warm enough to prevent ice formation that would narrow the flue. The storm continued through the night and into the second day. William maintained a large fire, both for heat and to test the chimney under maximum sustained load. The interior temperature of his cabin stayed comfortable. No smoke backed up, no drafting problems developed. On the morning of January 6th, the blizzard ended. William ventured outside into a transformed landscape. Snow had drifted to 6 feet deep in places. His cabin was buried to the windowsills. But his chimney stood tall and clear, smoke rising straight from the top. Within days, word spread through the scattered trapping community. Martin Driscoll arrived on January 8th with bad news. His traditional stone chimney had developed a massive crack during the blizzard. The extreme temperature differential between the fire-heated interior and the 40 below exterior had caused thermal stress the stone could not withstand. The crack ran vertically for 3 feet, allowing smoke to pour into his cabin. He had been forced to extinguish his fire and had spent 2 nights in dangerous cold before managing temporary repairs. Another trapper, Joseph Kerner, reported his short chimney had been completely buried. He had been forced to dig it out repeatedly during the storm, climbing onto his snow-covered roof in blizzard conditions to clear the bay opening. The work was exhausting and dangerous. William's hybrid chimney had functioned flawlessly. The stone base had handled the extreme heat without cracking. The wooden extension had remained clear of snow burial. The bracing had held stable under wind and snow load. The air gap insulation had prevented any fire risk. But the winter was not finished testing his design. January 10, 1843. William had barely processed the success of the first blizzard when the second storm arrived. This one came from the northeast, with even colder temperatures. The thermometer outside his cabin read 32 below zero by evening. Wind shrieked across the landscape at 50 miles per hour, driving snow horizontally with brutal force. The second blizzard was worse than the first. Colder air meant drier snow that drifted more easily. The wind created massive drifts against any vertical surface. William's cabin was buried even deeper, snow piling 7 feet high on the north side, where wind drove it against the logs. The temperature differential between his fireplace and the outside air was now extreme. 800 degrees inside the firebox, 32 below outside, a difference of more than 800 degrees. Stone chimneys across the territory were cracking under this stress. William's tapered design and careful stone selection were being tested to their limits. He maintained constant vigilance. Every 2 hours, day and night, he checked the chimney system. The stone base remained solid, no new cracks visible. The clay transition platform showed no deterioration. The wooden section stayed clear of dangerous ice buildup. The bracing held firm despite wind that made the entire cabin shudder. The second storm ended on January 13th. William had 3 days to recover, process what had happened, and prepare supplies. Other trappers were not as fortunate. 2 men abandoned their cabins entirely, their chimneys having failed. They traveled to the trading post 20 miles south, accepting the risk of travel over the certainty of freezing in cabins they could no longer heat safely. Those who remained with functional chimneys were rationing their fires, burning only enough to prevent freezing, living in smoke-filled spaces because damaged chimneys no longer drafted properly. The winter was exposing every weakness in traditional frontier construction. On January 16th, the third blizzard arrived. This storm would last 5 days and drop more snow than the previous 2 combined. William woke on the first morning to find his cabin completely buried, except for the chimney. Drifts had covered his door. The windows were invisible beneath snow. Only the top 8 feet of his chimney remained visible above the white surface. He was effectively entombed, but he was warm and safe. His hybrid chimney continued functioning perfectly. Smoke rose from the wooden top into gray skies. The draft remained strong. Heat filled his cabin. He melted snow for water and ate from supplies he had stockpiled. For 5 days, William lived in his snow-buried cabin while the blizzard raged. The fire never went out. The chimney never failed. On January 21st, when the storm finally ended, William dug himself out to find a landscape transformed. Snow depth exceeded 8 feet in drifts. The territory was buried under the heaviest snowfall anyone could remember. His chimney stood tall above it all, still drawing, still functional, still keeping him alive when traditional designs had failed across the entire region. Late January, 1843. As trappers emerged from their cabins after 3 blizzards in 11 days, a pattern became clear across the Montana Territory. Men with traditional chimneys had suffered. Some had died. Others had abandoned their cabins and survived only by traveling to trading posts or sharing shelters. Those who remained in cabins with damaged chimneys lived in dangerous conditions, breathing smoke, rationing fires, and risking their lives daily. William Calhoun's cabin, by contrast, had functioned perfectly throughout the entire ordeal. Word spread quickly through the mountain community. The crazy wooden chimney that everyone had predicted would burn down had instead become the only reliable design in the harshest winter anyone could remember. On January 24th, Martin Driscoll and 2 other trappers arrived at William's cabin. They wanted to see the hybrid chimney that had survived 3 blizzards. William walked them through every detail of the construction. He explained the stone base designed to handle extreme heat. He showed them the clay transition platform that insulated between stone and wood. He pointed out the iron stovepipe liner and explained how the air gap prevented heat transfer to the wooden walls. He demonstrated how the external bracing created structural stability that allowed the tall, lightweight wooden section to withstand wind without toppling. The trappers asked detailed questions. What were the exact measurements? How thick was the clay platform? Where did he find the iron stovepipe? How did he calculate the height where wood could safely begin? William answered everything. This was survival knowledge, not proprietary information. If his design could save lives, he wanted others to build it. By spring of 1843, 4 trappers had built hybrid chimneys based on William's design. By the following winter, a dozen more had adopted the technique. The design spread organically through the trapping community, carried by word of mouth and practical demonstration. Men who had seen traditional chimneys fail built tall chimneys with stone bases and wooden extensions. Variations emerged as different builders adapted the concept to available materials and personal preferences. Some used different woods. Some adjusted the dimensions. Some developed alternative bracing configurations. But the core principle remained constant. Stone where the heat was intense, wood where the heat had dissipated enough to be safe, external bracing for stability, and sufficient height to remain above even the deepest snow. The innovation saved lives. The exact number is impossible to determine because survival often goes unrecorded, but accounts from the period reference multiple instances of trappers surviving storms, specifically because their tall chimneys continued functioning when traditional designs failed. William himself left the mountains in 1847 as the fur trade declined. He moved to Oregon Territory, married, and lived quietly until his death in 1869. But his innovation outlasted him. Cabins built using his hybrid chimney technique remained functional for decades. A few still stood into the 20th century, their stone and wood chimneys weathered but intact, silent testimony to what one man's careful thinking had accomplished during one brutal winter.